Welcome to the debate. When you watch an Olympic sprinter cross the finish line, you're basically watching magic.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredible.
Right. You're captivated by that fluid, explosive, seemingly effortless motion. But what you aren't seeing are the hundreds of hours they spent in a quiet gym.
Right, just lifting weights in total isolation.
Exactly. Or doing these tiny repetitive foot drills without ever taking a full stride on the actual track. We easily accept that athletic power is built in isolation before it's ever performed under the bright lights of competition.
Yeah, it's the invisible foundational work. You don't just walk out of your house one day and run the 100-meter dash against professionals.
You really don't. But when we step into the world of adult language acquisition, that consensus completely shatters.
It really does.
Today, we're looking at a deeply divided landscape, specifically exploring the methodology presented in our source material, English Unleashed. We are looking at the core question of how adult learners actually achieve language fluency.
Which is a huge question.
Huge. Are we building that fluency most effectively through solitary, mechanical micro-habits and physiological conditioning? Or does true fluency inherently demand active, context-driven communication and meaning-making right from day one?
It really is the classic tension between the raw mechanics of speech and the actual, soul of communication. And it's something almost every single person who has tried to learn a second language as an adult has wrestled with.
The side of the mechanics here. The source material lays out a really compelling framework showing that solitary, repetitive exercises, techniques like shadowing, passive environmental immersion, recording private voice memos, those are the absolute essential physiological and psychological building blocks of fluency.
Right.
By isolating the learner, these micro-habits completely bypass the paralyzing anxiety of live interaction. It allows the brain to train the physical speaking muscles without the massive cognitive overload of social performance.
And my perspective is that reducing a language to mechanical echoing and, passive observation fundamentally mistakes rote mimicry for actual fluency.
Okay, but
the material presents a method where you practice without comprehension and speak without an audience. I'm going to argue that this is a false summit. True language acquisition inherently requires the cognitive load of active, meaningful interaction.
a false summit? Wow.
Yeah, because without meaning-making and external feedback, you aren't actually acquiring a language. You are just learning how to make sounds.
Well, let's unpack why the text goes so hard on those mechanics. It accurately identifies the primary roadblocks for adult learners.
Which are pretty significant.
Extremely. Massive social anxiety, the feeling of having absolutely no free time, and that debilitating cognitive delay where you are translating every single word in your head before you speak.
All the classic deer in the headlights freeze.
Yes, exactly. If you've ever tried to order coffee in Paris or speak Spanish at a grocery store, you know exactly what that freeze feels like.
It's awful.
Your brain is suddenly doing triple duty. You're translating the thought, managing your rising panic, and trying to physically force your tongue into unfamiliar shapes.
Right.
The material suggests stripping all of that away. It introduces a practice called shadowing, which is just echoing the tone, speed, and rhythm of native audio without stopping to translate or even look at a dictionary.
Just blindly repeating.
But even just 5 to 15 minutes of these low-stakes, solitary steps, like reading a children's book aloud in your living room, creates a vastly superior foundation for natural speech compared to hours of high-pressure textbook study. It is pure athletic conditioning for the vocal tract.
Okay. It is athletic conditioning. I'll grant you that. But that conditioning comes at a severe semantic cost.
How so?
This heavy reliance on isolated repetition and what the text calls passive learning, well, it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how the human brain actually acquires and utilizes language.
I mean, I'm not sure I'd call it a misunderstanding.
I would. Because there is a glaring contradiction running right through the heart of the source material. Early on, it emphatically claims you don't need a native speaker next to you and that you can just copy the sound like an echo.
Right, to build confidence.
It treats language like a solitary puzzle you can solve in your bedroom. Yet later on, it quietly admits that to make the language feel alive, you must join online groups like Tandem, Facebook, Telegram, and actively write to actual friends.
Well, sure.
It implicitly acknowledges that solitary repetition is entirely insufficient. Fluency relies on the exact meaning-making and human connection that those interactive suggestions provide, not the hollow echoing it so heavily promotes at the start.
I see why you'd view that as a contradiction, but I think it is actually a carefully sequenced progression.
A progression?
Yeah. Let's look closely at how shadowing actually functions neurologically. Shadowing is arguably the most controversial, yet most effective tool presented here. The text explicitly instructs learners to listen to English and repeat it exactly, at the same speed and tone. And crucially, it says shadowing is not about understanding every word.
Which is precisely what worries me.
Hear me out, though. Language is, at its base, a physical, athletic act. You are getting your mouth, your tongue, your jaw, your diaphragm used to entirely new shapes and airflows.
Sure, physically speaking.
Right. You're trying to roll an R or hit a TH sound that literally doesn't exist in your native tongue. I mean, practicing shadowing without comprehension is like a musician practicing scales with a metronome.
Okay.
You aren't making music yet, but you are building the exact muscle memory required to eventually play a sonata without having to stare at your fingers. I see why you think that's hollow, but let me give you a different perspective. It's preparation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay.
That's an appealing analogy, but I don't think it holds up when applied to linguistics. A musical scale still has intrinsic musical value, right? It adheres to the rules of harmony. But human language is entirely rooted in semantic attachment.
Semantic attachment?
Yes. Without meaning, words are just noise. The text's explicit instruction that shadowing is not about understanding every word is genuinely dangerous for an adult learner.
Dangerous in what way?
When the material tells a student to blindly repeat a phrase like, "I want to get better at English," without demanding they understand the semantic weight of those specific syllables, it trains them to be a parrot, not a conversationalist.
A parrot. That's a bit harsh.
But it's true. You are training the mouth, yes, but you are completely disengaging the linguistic center of the brain that maps sound to meaning.
Wait, I want to make sure I understand your critique here. Are you saying the practice of shadowing itself is bad, or just that relying on it exclusively without ever mapping the meaning is the problem?
I'm saying that practicing it without comprehension creates a really powerful illusion of competence.
Ah, I see.
When that learner finally gets into a real conversation, all that muscle memory is essentially useless because it isn't tethered to the cognitive intent to communicate a specific thought. They completely lack the generative syntax required to answer a spontaneous question.
Let's define generative syntax for a second, just to be clear for the discussion.
Sure. Generative syntax is basically the actual mental architecture needed to build a brand new sentence on the fly. Parroting a podcast host's rhythm doesn't give you the ability to spontaneously say, "Actually, I disagree with that point because of X, Y, and Z."
Right.
It just makes you sound really good when you're repeating something you memorized. The underlying architecture is completely hollow.
I hear that, but I think you are assuming the learner will never map the meaning. The text is very clear that this is a step-by-step, day-by-day. The shadowing lowers the barrier to entry.
By ignoring the meaning.
Look, if we demand that a tired adult learner understands 100% of the semantic weight, the syntax, and the grammar before they are allowed to open their mouth, they will freeze. They will literally never speak.
So you believe phonetic comfort has to come before comprehension?
Exactly. Yes. By decoupling the physical production of the sound from the crushing burden of immediate comprehension, the learner gets used to how English moves and feels in the mouth, as the material beautifully puts it.
Moves and feels.
Yeah, it's about creating phonetic comfort first. The meaning maps itself naturally over time as they encounter those exact same phrases in different real-world contexts.
But mapping over time is a highly inefficient way to learn. It relies on the hope that the brain will retroactively apply meaning to a sound it has already categorized as mere noise.
It's not mere noise, it's...
If you practice saying a sentence 50 times without knowing what it means, you have ingrained a motor pattern, sure. But fluency is the ability to generate novel sentences in response to unpredictable stimuli.
Well, they won't freeze in response to those unpredictable stimuli if they've already mapped the language's rhythm into their subconscious. And that actually ties directly into how the text suggests building that underlying architecture you're worried about through passive environmental conditioning.
Oh, you mean the whole change your phone settings strategy?
Yes, shifting from active physical repetition to passive input. The material champions the idea of changing your phone's operating system to English.
Right.
Think about it. You see words like airplane mode, brightness, update available, and delete perhaps 100 times a day. You aren't sitting down with flashcards to study them. You are leveraging the brain's innate pattern recognition software.
It's incredibly convenient, I'll give it that.
It's more than convenient. The text goes further and suggests letting English run as background music while you cook, clean, or commute.
Which I have major issues with.
But it argues that even if you only understand 30 to 50% of an audio track, letting those sounds enter your ears subconsciously tunes you to the rhythm of the language without the stress of active study. It turns the language into a feature of your daily habitat.
That sounds great on paper. That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the actual qualitative depth of this passive learning? What do you mean by depth?
Let's take the phone settings example you just mentioned. Sure, you see airplane mode or brightness 100 times a day, and your brain learns to associate that specific visual string of letters with the physical action of dimming your screen. But that is highly domain-specific vocabulary.
Domain-specific, meaning it only applies to the digital world?
Exactly. Knowing the word settings or download in a digital interface does not transfer to conversational agility. You cannot use the grammatical structure of update available to help you order a meal, negotiate a business contract, or, express sympathy to a friend who had a bad day.
Well, obviously.
It is a very shallow form of vocabulary acquisition that's basically masquerading as deep immersion.
It may be shallow initially, but that is the entire point of building a foundation. The text states that English should become part of your real everyday life, just like your morning coffee.
But is it real life?
When a learner sees delete or brightness on their phone, they are experiencing English functioning in reality, doing a real job, not just sitting in a textbook exercise. It demystifies a language. It completely removes the intimidation factor.
But what about the background music concept? treating a language as background noise while cooking or exercising?
Neurologically, our brains are statistical learning machines. By constantly exposing the auditory cortex to the prosody of English.
Let's define prosody for a second for the audience.
Right, the prosody, the musicality of the language, the stress timing, the specific intonation, the way native speakers naturally link words together and drop certain syllables.
Okay.
By bathing in that, the learner is subconsciously mapping the boundaries of words, even if they only grasp 30% of the meaning. It prepares the brain so that when they do sit down for an active study session, the language doesn't sound entirely alien.
The danger there, though, is habitual tuning out. When you treat language as background noise while you chop onions or run on a treadmill, you are quite literally training your brain to ignore it.
Ignore it.
Yes. You are teaching your auditory processing centers that English is non-essential auditory clutter.
You think it actually creates a bad habit?
Absolutely. The text explicitly says, let the sounds enter your ears, but hearing is merely physiological. Listening is cognitive. If you are only understanding 30% and you aren't actively trying to bridge that gap, you breed a habit of passive disengagement.
I see.
So when it finally comes time to actually listen to a real human being standing right in front of you, you have to fight against the very habit you just spent months building, the habit of treating English as background music.
That's a really fair warning, though. I think the text addresses it by framing this as an additive process. It isn't suggesting that passive listening replaces active engagement.
It certainly leans heavily on it, though.
But it's a supplement that fills the dead space in a busy adult's life. The material is speaking directly to the student who says, I don't have time, I work 50 hours a week. In that context, passive listening on a commute is infinitely better than zero exposure.
I suppose.
And frankly, the text does transition learners from just taking information in to actually producing language themselves. This is where we get to the most innovative aspect of the methodology, solitary output.
You're talking about the monologues.
Exactly. The text advocates for whispering simple thoughts to yourself throughout the day. Things like, it's morning, I'm still sleepy. Or writing a quick 3-sentence private diary entry like, I drank 2 cups of coffee.
Right.
But the real pinnacle of this technique is recording a private 1-minute voice message at the end of the day. You talk about your plans, your feelings, entirely to yourself.
Just speaking into the void.
Speaking into a highly secure environment. The brilliance of this is that it completely bypasses what linguists call the affective filter.
Let's make sure we're clear on that term, too.
The affective filter is essentially that emotional barrier, the fear of embarrassment, the hot flash of shame when you mispronounce a word that completely prevents learners from utilizing the vocabulary they actually know.
Right, the psychological block.
By recording a voice memo that literally no one else on earth will ever hear, the learner feels completely safe. The text argues that when you listen back to your own recording, you build immense self-awareness. You suddenly notice your own grammar mistakes, and you can fix them for the next day, all in a perfectly protected, unjudged environment.
Okay, let's stop right there because the idea of private, solitary self-correction is fundamentally flawed. It assumes a level of linguistic expertise the learner simply does not possess. I come at it from a different way.
How do you mean?
Well, if an adult learner makes a structural error in their private voice memo, let's say they confidently say, today I go to the work, instead of I went to work, and they listen back to it, they often lack the underlying grammatical framework to even realize it is an error.
But
the text claims you will notice your common mistakes and fix them. How? If you knew it was a mistake, you wouldn't have made it in the first place.
because there's a difference between what you know and what you can produce under pressure.
Even so, without external, corrective feedback from another human, solitary practice risks fossilization.
Meaning they cement their errors?
Exactly. Cementing the errors into place. You are quite literally practicing your mistakes, engraving them deeper and deeper into your neural pathways every single night in that private 1-minute recording.
I see why that's a major concern, but I think you are underestimating the massive gap between a learner's receptive knowledge, what they can understand, and their productive knowledge, what they can actually say.
Sure, cognitive overload causes performance errors.
Right, often learners know the grammar rule perfectly well when they read it in a book, but in the heat of speaking, they drop the past tense or they forget the plural S.
That happens, yeah.
But when they listen to their own voice recording later in a calm state with their affective filter totally lowered, their receptive knowledge kicks in. They hear themselves and think, I said I go, but I was talking about yesterday, I should have said I went.
I'm not convinced that happens as often as the text implies.
That moment of self-correction is incredibly powerful for memory consolidation. It builds a robust internal monitor.
An internal monitor can only take you so far, though, and honestly, this is exactly where the source material tips its hand.
Tips its hand.
Yeah. It spends all this time validating solitary practice, telling learners they don't need a native speaker, they can just whisper to themselves in the kitchen and shadow podcasts. But then, in tip number 4, it explicitly instructs learners to join a WhatsApp group, use language exchange websites like Tandem, or jump into Facebook groups to write messages and send voice notes to other people.
Yes, it introduces social integration.
But the text itself says this is what makes English feel alive and become a way to connect. It admits, perhaps inadvertently, that the solitary crucible is not enough.
Well,
When someone sends you a voice note on WhatsApp, they might mumble, they might use slang, they might ask a question you weren't prepared for. You absolutely need authentic interaction, real dialogue, the sheer unpredictability of another human being responding to you to actually achieve fluency.
I really don't see that as a contradiction. I see it as a brilliantly sequenced scaffolding. You don't take someone who is terrified of the water and throw them into the deep end of the ocean to teach them how to swim.
But you also don't just...
You let them practice the mechanics of breathing and kicking on the edge of the shallow pool first.
But they aren't swimming yet.
No, but they are preparing to. The solitary habits, the shadowing, the private voice memos, the phone settings, that is the shallow end. They build the fundamental physical and psychological capacity. So when the learner finally does join that WhatsApp group or a Tandem exchange, they actually have the physical speaking muscles and the baseline confidence to hit the ground running.
The problem with the shallow end is that people tend to stay there because it is warm and comfortable. The text offers so many solitary mechanical microhabits that a learner could easily spend an hour a day checking off these tasks, shadowing, reading a children's book aloud, writing a private diary, and feel a completely false sense of immense progress.
You think they're just tricking themselves?
Absolutely. They are doing English homework disguised as modern lifestyle habits.
Wow.
Because none of those solitary activities require negotiating meaning with another human being, clarifying a misunderstanding, reading a subtle tone of voice, rapidly adjusting your syntax to make a point. They are not actually practicing fluency. They are practicing a performance. And when they finally face a real, unstructured conversation, the shock of unpredictability will be just as paralyzing as if they hadn't done the solitary work at all.
But consider how the material fundamentally redefines what the work even is. It insists that English shouldn't feel like something you agonizingly study for 30 minutes on a Monday night, but something you just live with.
Live with in a vacuum.
By integrating these solitary actions, changing a grocery list to English, watching a 20-second Instagram reel, and repeating the cadence, The learner is weaving the language into the very fabric of their daily existence.
Woven into their existence, yes, but only as a solitary echo. If we look closely at what the material proposes, it is a highly controlled, heavily curated version of the language.
Controlled isn't inherently bad.
When you repeat an Instagram reel, you are just copying a script. When you write 3 sentences about drinking coffee in a private journal, you are completely controlling the narrative. Fluency is inherently messy. It is the ability to survive in the uncontrolled, wild environment of human interaction. While I concede that phonetic practice has its value, I maintain that true acquisition is blocked if the learner is constantly shielded from the cognitive demand of real-time, meaningful dialogue.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, I look at the framework provided by English Unleashed, and I see a highly pragmatic, neurologically sound approach for the modern busy adult. Treating language acquisition as a series of physical, solitary micro-habits where English lives quietly in your phone settings, your daily journal, and your private, unjudged voice memos systematically strips away the paralyzing pressure of formal study and live social interaction.
Right.
It rightfully acknowledges that speaking is a physical act requiring muscle memory. And by establishing these low-stakes routines, the learner successfully lays the vital physiological and psychological groundwork that makes eventual fluency possible.
And while I absolutely agree that establishing a routine is helpful, I have to maintain that true fluency cannot be achieved or even properly simulated in a vacuum.
Fair enough.
Echoing sounds without comprehension and passively swiping past English menus on a screen represent a false summit of language acquisition. These mechanical habits must be rapidly superseded by the exact thing the text briefly touches upon but underemphasizes: active, meaning-making communication, connecting with actual humans, negotiating ideas on the fly, and facing the unpredictable nature of real dialogue. That is the only true crucible for language.
It really highlights the fascinating duality of language itself, doesn't it? On one hand, it is a purely physical, mechanical habit of the mouth, tongue, and breath.
And on the other hand, it is the most complex cognitive tool we possess for deep human connection and meaning. You can't really have one without the other.
Exactly. Examining the tension between those two realities, the mechanical and the meaningful, offers a much deeper way to approach the methodology in this material. It challenges us to look closely at our own learning habits. Are we just lifting weights in an empty gym, or are we preparing to actually run the race?
That's the real question.
We will leave that for you to weigh on your own. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.